All right, great. Well, welcome again, everyone, to our co-learn. This week, we're studying money, what it is and isn't, with Professor Chris Desan. Sorry if I'm saying that. Chris Desan teaches about the international monetary system, the constitutional law of money, constitutional history, political economy, and legal theory. She is the co-founder of Harvard's program on the study of capitalism and an interdisciplinary project that brings together classes, resources, research funds, and advising aimed at exploring that topic. She is the founder and managing editor of justmoney.org, a website that explores money as a critical site of governance. She has recently published a book called Making Money: Coin, Currency, and the Coming of Capitalism, which was published by Oxford University in 2014. And she is also the editor of Inside Money: Retheorizing Liquidity, which is in progress. She's a co-editor with Sven Beckert of Capitalism in America, New Histories, which was in 2018. And Chris is also a member of the Massachusetts Public Banking Coalition, which Ujima is also a part of, which is focused on the growing effort across the Commonwealth to establish a public bank. Explore our public banking edition wire with Chris in our 2021 workshop with Chris and Massachusetts Banking Coalition. And with that, I will hand over the floor to Christine Desan. Thank you very much for your time tonight, Professor.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I thought what I would do is tell 3 stories about money. Actually, I have a PowerPoint. Is it possible? Can I go ahead and, okay, is it possible to get sharing privileges? Are one of you able to enable me to share my
co-host? One second.
Okay.
Yeah, I just made you a co-host.
Okay. Okay, super. So let's see if I can do this now. Whoops. So is that, are you able to see that? Okay,
Yes.
super. So I just thought I would do this, as I said, money in 3 acts, talk about 3 kinds of money, give you 3 stories about money. There's a myth about money, which is important because it really affects the way people think. And it has lots of loaded content that's, submerged. But once you start thinking about the money, you realize it's loaded with very particular assumptions. Then I will tell a second story that's about basic money. That's really, as far as we know, what money is and how it works. And that's important because it shows us basically that money is a political relationship between governments and individuals, or between political communities and individuals. As you know, if you're in Ujima, you can make monies within any kind of community. And then I'll tell a third story about banked money, which is the kind of money we have today. And it really is, in my view, the way to define capitalism. I think this is what brings capitalism, and a really good definition of capitalism is a society that delegates money creation to banks to be in charge of. So just to start with, let's see if I remember. Okay, here's the first story. This is the myth about money. And as I'm talking, I'd really love it if you're thinking about, why does this myth matter? What are its loaded kind of implications? So the story is, in the beginning, everybody just trades things with each other. And as they're trading all these things, as in this picture, and in these early, do I have to admit people if I'm the host, or somebody else doing that? Anyway.
I'm letting them in.
Okay, super. In these stories, this mythology about money, people are trading chickens for pigs, wheat for salt, services like I babysit your children, you fix my roof. And as they're trading these things, and the trade is this great soup of exchange. As they're trading in this broth, something rises to the surface naturally, like fat to the top of broth. And it's the thing that's easiest to give and take, gold or silver coin, shells, something like that, and that becomes money. This is an incredibly stubborn intuition. A couple of years ago, a really sophisticated commentator who was writing a column, who writes a column on money, said, you know, once upon a time, people thought gold was intrinsically valuable, so they used it as money. Then they moved to paper redeemable and gold, then they dropped the gold. So he's taking the story forward to explain banking. And everyone just sort of shrugged and said, this is from his column, that's fine, we like paper. It's not like we were exchanging it for gold much anyway. And now the piece of paper does the work because we trust it. Right? In other words, money is a convention, a social convention. It works, here's the way somebody else puts it, it works because everyone thinks it will work. An economist writes, money is similar to language or an inch or standard time or the convention designating which side of the road to be on. If you think about this story, it makes money emerge very naturally. Actually, I'd love to hear, you know, sort of the implications that you're seeing in it. So shall I stop there, and am I allowed to ask questions, right? So, you know, if you think about the story, what does it suggest about the political community, for example? Anybody want to take a guess? Take a stab at that? I'm not sure I can see everybody.
I think it suggests trust.
Okay, trust. It doesn't suggest politics, that's for sure. There's no politics in this story. Who, you know, who are the motive forces in the story?
Jock in the chat says that everyone agrees on value.
A really interesting point. So part of what's actually, I would say, weird about the story is that everyone agrees about value, whereas we don't really know what value is. So it assumes that value can just be exchanged, that it's obvious that people have a kind of shared sense of what value is before they have money. I think that's actually very weird. It also suggests that money arises spontaneously. It arises, if you think about it, it arises spontaneously by the bilateral actions of people. So these people are just making bilateral deals. Deal making is in the center of the story. There's trust, but there's no government, right? You don't need politics. That is to say, we're not actually thinking about power relations in the story. We're just thinking about people, we're assuming that people are equally endowed and equally skilled. The character of money doesn't really matter. If you think about the story, could be gold, could be shell, could be, it's just a convention, which side of the road you're on. It works because everyone thinks it'll work. That kind of language just puts money in a black box, right? We don't actually think what it is. The government is basically invisible in this story. Oops, sorry, I'm moving ahead a little bit. This approach to money, while it's intuitively accessible and attractive, allows economists to claim that the market is a natural and democratic institution. So money is chosen, as I said, by the kind of decentralized deal making of individuals who do that naturally. They're crowdsourcing money. It's a unit by acclaim. Second, if you think about the money, if money rises to the top of the broth, then it's dispersed widely among the population. We don't actually worry about money how money's injected and in whose hands it appears. Instead, like language or like trust, it just kind of floats to the surface, right? It rises to the surface. Finally, all are kind of happy to give and take this kind of money. There's a consensus about what it is. That is, the market takes shape naturally. In fact, notice a kind of amazing transition here. If you think about it, we've gone from a medium to a market, and the market, if you think about all those descriptors, sounds pretty democratic. We all picked a money by converging on it. We had that money widely available by definition to all of us, sort of by definition, if you think about it rising to the surface. We used money to make exchange that we knew we wanted to make, so we all make our individual choices. The market is the aggregate of decisions by individuals identifying their preferences, right? Sounds like modern economics. It's decentralized, it's accessible to all. The product of this exchange is the product of our choices. There's a great quote by Milton Friedman I didn't write down that basically says, you know, the market is very democratic. Everyone gets the choice of the color of their own tie. And this is very much the foundational myth of that kind of approach to the market. The problems with the story, there's no evidence for it, right? It turns out that in order to get the kind of rich trade that you see in the picture, you probably need a medium, right? Otherwise, people are all stuck in their own corners, having trouble trading things that are difficult and awkward to trade with each other. The story is also circular. So barter doesn't produce that much trade, enough trade to make something float to the surface. And then that thing that floats to the surface is valuable precisely because it's supposed to facilitate trade, but we don't really need it, right? The trade is already robust. Another problem, if money did come about this way, there's no reason to think it would last, right? The biggest players in this market would just take everybody else's money. There's literally no government here. There's nobody enforcing it. The bullies would just take the money. So second explanation. So that is the foundational myth. And if it sounded familiar to you, it's probably because you've heard it before. The Fed published a comic book last year, a couple years ago, that basically plays out this foundational story. So I'm just going to take that away for a moment to tell a different story. And this story is basic money, as far as we can figure out. I'm going to call it the stakeholder story. And it starts, instead of individuals who are making deals, it starts with groups. So from the beginning, people have acted in groups as well as individuals. Groups are as old, as important as our individual and individuated lives. We see those groups from the very beginning. If we look at early worlds from the beginning of the American world, for that matter, they can be organized in many different ways. And here's again a great, Ujima is a great reference point for this. So they can be organized by family, by kinship, by communities, by politics, right? They can be official states or less formal ones. They can be democratic or dictatorial, but we see them pop up again and again. The central authority in many early worlds. So I spent a lot of time studying early worlds in England, and many of those small communities were probably ruled by warlords. So these groups are intact, and they're supported. The reason they stick together and last over time is that they're supported by their members. So these groups that produce money are organized around or require, either voluntarily or dictatorially, some kind of contribution from their members over time. So think of a small community, an early world in which people are all giving a day of work a month. So that's the kind of model. Now, the stakeholder is some kind of decision maker for the community, and I'm calling it a stakeholder because we don't know if it's a warlord or, you know, a democratic council or a religious leader. That stakeholder is taking these contributions. Money seems to come about when there's some kind of emergency in the community. In these early worlds, it could be an attack on the community, or it could be less violent. It could be, you know, a dam breaks that the community relies upon. At that moment, the stakeholder can't wait around for people to make their routine contributions. The stakeholder drafts people before their time is come, right? Has come for their contribution, and says, please come give your day of work early. People come, give their day of work early, and the stakeholder gives the person a token that is basically recognition that they've given their contribution early to the community. This is, in other words, a kind of, and here I'm gonna switch. I'm gonna see if I can do this technology. Now I'm just looking for my pencil. Okay, so this is the different logic that I'm spelling out. Huh. Okay, that explains it, right? You can't write white on white. So here's the government or the stakeholder. You can tell where I'm going with this because this is basically the kind of money we use. The government is going to give people tokens. The people, this is the person, so the person who received the token when they first, I'm puzzled because I drew something on my board and you didn't get it all. Let me finish telling the story and then we'll look at another picture of this. The person who received the token, when their time comes around to put in their day of work, just gives back the token, right? So the token is basically a credit for work due the community. One more step makes it money, which is that the stakeholder can say to people, so actually let me step back and just reiterate this. If you're giving somebody a token that marks their political contribution, in a way, you're capturing the value of a political contribution in the form of a token. That token represents political contribution. When the person gives it back, everyone knows that that's worth one day of work. Second step to making this money, the stakeholder need only say, and by the way, you can pass on this political contribution to somebody else. So we're in a small society. We gave a token to someone for military work. Before their time comes to pay their dues, they might actually use it to buy something with. Everyone knows what it's worth now. It's not a question of awkward, incommensurable things. We know that that's worth one day's contribution. So someone can use that contribution, that token, to pay someone else who will later turn it into the stakeholder to exonerate themselves from one day of contribution. So what I wanted to draw, and I'm not quite sure why it's not showing up for you. Let me try drawing it again. You've got, whoops. I might just have to switch back to the PowerPoint where I have another picture of it, but it's kind of good to see it in action. No, sorry, it's just not going to work. Okay, so let me switch away from that. Luckily, I have another picture of it on here. This is basically the logic that I was trying to draw. That's kind of nice to see in action. The government is basically spending when it gives people tokens, and it's taking back those tokens later. If you think about the capacity of the warlord, instead of waiting routinely for people to pay, what the warlord ends up institutionalizing is a system where it can pay people when it needs them, and then it can take back those IOUs through taxation. That seems to be what's actually happening, and then the government will make this money negotiable. Part of what's interesting about the basic story and the contest over how money came about is that we don't actually have to go back to an early age in order to understand how money came about. It turns out governments are frequently inventing money if you just look for the occasion of their inventing money. So I thought, okay, let's look at one of the clearest times that a government invented a basic money. This is the greenback. So this was the Civil War. The federal government had been asleep at the switch for several decades before the Civil War, an era in which state power was ascending, and the federal government had actually kind of decimated its Navy, had very little money in its treasury. Eve of the Civil War, so now we're talking 1860, US goes to war. Turns out it has something like $500,000 in its treasury. It's going to cost several $1,000,000 a day. So to fight this war, what does the US do? It does exactly what our story predicted. The US government is the stakeholder in our example. It creates IOUs. This is a token saying to soldiers who would owe taxes, we don't have time to wait for the soldiers to scrounge around for whatever silver coin was still circulating and start in order to fund the war. Instead, what the government does is say, we'll pay you early to come work for the United States. So if you look, this is literally a picture of the greenback. It says the United States will pay the bearer $1. The way they pay the bearer, if you look down below, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. In other words, there's no promise here to pay in silver or gold coin. This isn't redeemable in anything but your ability to use it on your taxes. So the greenback, a beautiful example of a basic money. We can look at, this is the current, just to move forward here. Here's the US code. I'm a law teacher, right? So this is literally the way money works today. So now we use Federal Reserve notes. I'm about to get to banked money. If you look at the underlined language, the said notes shall be obligations of the United States receivable by all national member banks and Federal Reserve and for all taxes, customs, and other public duties. It's this that keeps that makes the dollar hold value. It's not that we trust in some amorphous way. It's true we trust, but we trust because we all have to pay our taxes in this. We all have to pay our taxes in this, and therefore, and if we had to pay our taxes in something else tomorrow, you can bet that the dollar would lose value. Trust would not hold it up, independently. The other quality of money that I mentioned before is that you can pay somebody else with it. Also helps support its value, and we can actually map out how much is from taxes and how much is from the fact that Grace can use this to pay Jamie, right? So legal tender for all debts means for any debt you owe somebody else, this is what the courts will enforce, and that gives the dollar extra value. So if you think about this story, I'd love to hear you on this story, right? This story has very different implications, a very different image of the market or an image of money. I don't know if anybody wants to say if anything strikes them.
I just had one question. Who creates Federal Reserve notes?
Okay.
And I guess
you are just totally going to banked money. So hang on just 1 second, and then I was just showing the current law is actually the greenback. There is this moment of decision after the Civil War. So during the Civil War, to get ahead of the story a little bit, the US invents two kinds of money: the greenback, which is basic money, and banked money. and banked money survives, and the greenback is slowly put to sleep by the government, right? It's a choice that the US has a choice. It's a complicated story, a really interesting one. And turns out banked money wins, and that eventually becomes Federal Reserve notes. But even, I'm hoping I can show you, even with that money, the underlying logic is going to be the same as you can see in to go back one to the statute that makes it really obvious, right, to the statutory provision. Even Federal Reserve notes work according to the same logic. So I'm just gonna, I realize our time is a little short. I'm gonna just throw out, in this story, if you look at this kind of logic, money comes from political communities. Money is actually political obligation encapsulated in a token, in some kind of unit. Money connects the community and its members, for better or worse, right? It could be, well, the greenback was an emancipatory currency. I am a huge fan of the greenback, right? That allowed the government to mobilize resources by spending IOUs and taxing them back later. So you can see how it can be a really empowering medium. Having said that, it enters circulation selectively. So this was spent, greenbacks were spent to soldiers and were spent on military hardware, right? And that's what made the market in the Civil War. The Civil War market was made by government spending to soldiers and military suppliers. The whole story, right, is one in which we then have to ask, what is the nature of this money? It's a kind of credit. We get that it's a kind of credit. It matters. It's a political project, matters how the government relates to people, and it matters what the government spends money on. So a very different kind of story. Okay, third story, which is what, I don't know who actually asked me the question. Was that Jock? Was that you who asked the question?
That was me.
Okay. So second kind of money that was invented during the Civil War, and it's a version of this money that is our current money, is this, right? The step one is, the step two is actually the Fed, which I don't know that we get to today, but basically, here's the other thing that happened during the Civil War. The government gave long-term obligations to banks. There were a set of, the reason it did this in part is that there were lots of banks already on the ground at the state level. So the states had been in control, as I said, the federal government kind of asleep at the switch for a couple of several decades. There were all these state chartered banks, like in Massachusetts, Rockland Trust, chartered by the state of Massachusetts. And all of these state banks were giving out notes. And the irony of the Civil War is that, the federal government is then supposed to fight a state-led insurrection on the basis of a whole bunch of different state banknotes, none of the value of which it knew. So instead, what it does is it decides to, it attempts, tries to get all those banks to recharter. That worked partway, and it makes those banks federal, or it makes as many of them as it could federal. And it gave those banks, in other words, it placed long-term IOUs, it borrowed from those banks in their notes. So look, I have greenbacks there, but I really should have also written national banknotes. I was just economizing for time, but it also should say national banknotes. The government is going to borrow from these banks. It also borrows greenbacks, can borrow either one, but the newly kind of, the future is going to be with banks that create their own banknotes. So add to that list greenbacks plus national banknotes. The government puts a bond, a long-term IOU, promising to repay the banks with the banks. It borrows banknotes, it spends them into circulation just like greenbacks, and it taxes them back out of circulation. So we could also add, let's see if I can do this. Maybe I can, oh yeah. So this is national banknotes. These are adding to the, right? And we have national banknotes. Is that writing? Yeah. We're creating a whole different kind of money here. This is the third kind of money. This is the banked architecture of money. I don't know why my pencil sometimes gives out, but under greenbacks, I actually wrote on my slide national banknote, and on the bottom, I also wrote national banknote. So a little technological glitch here, but here's the interesting thing about one of the interesting things about this image that's on your screen. It's not really necessary to use the banks, right? In some strict way, it's not necessary to use the banks. The government could just issue its own IOUs and tax them back in. And in fact, if you look at the map, which is how these banks worked and basically still work today, the fact that the government spends in bank money and taxes it back in matters enormously. That's what's supporting the system in many ways. But having said that, and let me show you, we'll just go here. This is the national banknote. And I can't get it to advance. Sorry. Oh, I'd love you to see a picture of the national banknote. So there's a picture of the national banknote. I'll keep tapping on it and hope we could get there. Let me see. The interesting thing about the national banknote is it says the Appleton National Bank will pay $500 to the bearer of the demand note, right? In other words, it puts the bank in the middle of the relationship between the government and the people that it's paying. So in this case, so we could sort of, it'd be fun to talk about the implications here. In this case, there's intermediation of money creation. There's money creation now by an industry that's a for-profit industry, the banks. The government supports that industry by taking the notes of the banks and by other measures. Today, the Fed, and looks like I can't get it to advance on your screen. It's just I'm happy to send you the PowerPoint if you want to see the other pictures. These banks have advantages in lending to people because they're supported by the government. So the facility that banks have to lend is because they're within the support network of the government, because the government is basically using them as money creators. Because they can lend more cheaply than other financiers. So if you think about, payday lender being the worst, but also a general sort of a car finance or something like this, those are at higher rates because those lenders don't create money as they lend. These national banks are creating money as they lend. Because banks have such advantages in making money, they can therefore lend at relatively lower rates. They dominate the credit industry. This is why, for me, this kind of money is identified with capitalism, in my view, because banks, which serve as our agents of money creation, are only going to lend as profit drives them to lend. That's their mission. Their mission is not to help you out of the goodness of their heart. Their mission is to earn money by lending. So we have basically gone from, a direct issue basic note to relying on a system in which banks dominate the money supply. And that's our third story. Why did they do it, by the way? The government, just to throw this in, although, we might want to talk about it in discussion, they did it in part because they wanted to recruit all these banks and use the working money system that they had. They did it also because by recruiting all these banks, you're basically recruiting recruiting a very wealthy industry. Right? You're recruiting investors who are wealthy enough to be important players in the economy, and you're binding them to allegiance to the North, right, to the Union. So part of what they're doing is creating a political alliance between the government and investors, that those investors will in the future be important influences in the way the monetary system is run, because obviously they have an interest in, for example, making sure that the money's taxed back in, policing the system. Eventually they'll have an interest, you know, the reason that we support banks so vehemently, for example, in the COVID crisis in 2020 and in the financial crisis of 2008, is because we've now made them essential. So we don't have the greenback anymore. It's taxed out of existence eventually, sometime early 20th century. And we rely today on the banked system. I'm really sorry I can't get the show you more pictures, but I'll take down the PowerPoint so we can see each other better. And if I can figure out how to stop the share. Anyway, you're welcome to, I'd love to hear what you think about the story. And how do I exit out of here? Sorry, haven't done this in too long.
Yeah, no worries, Christine. We can
You know what? You can
Yeah.
just stop. You can just knock me off hosting, and that will. And for some reason, I'm not getting a stop share message. But if you knock me off hosting, that'll do it, and then we
Let me
can see
try
each
that.
other. Yeah, sorry, I don't know why I'm not getting a stop share sign. Great, super, thank you. And now I'll restore me. Anyway, love to hear what you think about these three different forms of money. Which ones seem intuitively more obvious to you? If you have any questions, happy to talk about them. It's weird, right? I mean, one thing we could talk about if people are interested, you know, the delegation to banks, which is basically what happened at the Civil War moment, happened earlier in some ways, in the sense that the states were playing around with this system. Has advantages and disadvantages, right? I'm a critic, but there are some people who would say, you don't want the money, you don't want the government to be in charge of money. You want it to be in private hands. You want to provide a check on the system. You want a group of intermediaries to police the system. So those are a lot of the arguments that you hear. From my point of view, and this connects, I'll connect this to the public bank, as Nancy knows. These intermediaries are only going to lend, as I mentioned, as is advantageous to them. It's not their, you know, they don't see themselves as public actors. In fact, the very incentives, the reasons that we might say banks are good, you know, it's not the government. They're lending not for partisan reasons, just for profit reasons. They're lending without regard to other, supposedly without regard to other factors. It's just money driving them, right? All of those things mean that they are going to leave out recurringly a whole bunch of people who aren't profitable for them, according to their own judgment, and it's the banks that make the judgment of how to lend. The banks are not even a public accommodation. So they're not even within the Civil Rights Act. It's astonishing, right? That is to say, the sentiment is so strong that you know, banking is a private activity. And to connect this to the myth that we started with, the myth is so strong that money is private, arose spontaneously, is the product of exchanging individuals. government is invisible or shouldn't get involved, right? All of those things protect the banks from scrutiny. So, you know, the fact that we have recurringly a whole set of people left out because it's not in the bank's short-term interest to lend to them is the best argument ever for a public bank. The government, I mean, I'd actually be in favor, I am in favor of direct issue. I think the government should just issue greenbacks again. But short of that, the state of Massachusetts, right, issuing greenbacks would be up to the federal government. State doesn't have that authority under the Constitution. So short of that, what a state can do is set up its own bank, become one of those players in that central sort of intermediating role, and then make loans to the people who are currently shut out of the system by the profit-driven commercial banks. So you can see in the, you know, you can see in the structure of the story, I think, why there's an argument for the public bank. Let's see, there's something, yeah, Grace.
I had a question. The federal government is the one that actually prints the money.
Mm-hmm.
Where does that fit in?
So
You're
if I
saying it
could,
belongs
yeah.
to the banks?
If I could have shown you the next, if we wanted to take it a step further, after the Civil War, there are all these banks in the middle, literally, of the picture. And they have to, in order to get money, in order to get their banknotes, they're not allowed, just, they have to actually buy government bonds. So when I said, you know, the government's borrowing from them, and I had that arrow that shows the government giving the banks bonds and taking their money, the banks literally have to buy government bonds in order to get national banknotes. So in a way, those national banknotes were national money. Couple decades, it's still a really clunky system, not very stable, in part because the banks can't respond when the society needs more money. So if the government's not borrowing, but the society needs more money, like there's, as you might know, a great upsurge in agriculture in those years, and a diminution of the coin supply. That was the agrarian populist movement. And, you know, the US is under the gold standard, all sorts of complicating factors, but basically this system was very rigid. And so in 1913, the federal government establishes the Fed. And the Fed comes in like a mother bank. So in my picture, it's above, you know, it's kind of architecturally above the banks. And banks actually are now today lending in promises to pay Federal Reserve money. So if you think, and the Federal Reserve will become the source of money, of all money. So in order to get money, just like in the old days, they had to lend the government a bond. Today, the banks, the way the system actually works is that the Fed monetizes government debt and produces Federal Reserve notes or Federal Reserve deposits for the banks. That is to say, you know, and this is a longer discussion. I mean, this is like takes us a whole semester at school. So we're packing a huge amount into half an hour. But so I'm skipping lots of steps. But the Fed takes government bonds. When you hear like quantitative easing, the Fed is buying government bonds, or it's buying financial assets, and it's producing Federal Reserve notes or Federal Reserve deposits. So those mostly it's producing deposits for the banks, and those, you know, it will buy financial assets, bonds, or mortgage-backed securities from the banks, and it will give them deposits. And they can then, using their own, quote, banknotes, they create bank credit, and they lend to people with those notes, or, you know, Federal Reserve money in reserve. That's why it's called the Federal Reserve, by the way, right? So it's got sovereign money in reserve, the bank, and it's extending credit on its own account. So the banks today, they're no longer producing their own notes, but they are producing. If you go to the bank and you ask for a loan. And if they give you one, because it turns out you count as a borrower they like, as opposed to when they don't, you will give them a long-term IOU, just like in the picture, and they will give you a deposit, which is just their credit extended to you. It's like giving you banknotes, and you will then go spend the banknotes. And they have to have enough in reserve that when people cash the banknotes, they can give them, they have a reserve to cash out. So just to take one more step, as I said, this takes us a whole semester. So I feel like, it's really, you're absolutely right to ask questions about how the Federal Reserve fits in here, but it does get complicated. Just one more thing about the way these banks are working. So they're all extending their own credit. They all have a reserve at the Federal Reserve, right? So it's like the anchor for the banks that we added in 1913. They all extend credit. And what they do with all that credit is they set it off against each other. Credit goes out there, you write a check, to Rockland Trust, somebody else writes a check from Eastern to Rockland Trust, you're going from Rockland Trust to Eastern. All this credit offsets each other. And the Fed is the huge clearinghouse in the sky for all that credit. And they don't have to move that many reserves, because mostly what the banks are doing is giving people credit and then settling it off against every other bank in the United States. And actually internationally, there's this huge kind of multilateral settlement. They don't actually have to move too many reserves. And they're all the while earning money on the credit, on the extension of credit to all of us. So it's a really lucrative industry. It's a brilliant system. It really did change the world in terms of creating liquidity and creating disparity. So in my opinion, when we think about, this system was sweeping across the globe. Part of the other reason the US went with it in 1860, I think it's 1862 that they passed the National Bank Act. Part of the reason they're doing this is because it's sweeping the globe, because it creates so much, it generates money very easily. You have all these private bankers out there lending to people. So you're irrigating the economy. So all of that is great. It's just that they're also doing it for their own private desserts. And therefore they're creating a really disparate economy, an economy that is both productive and highly likely to lead to unequal benefits.
I'm sorry, I have one more question.
Yeah,
Unless anyone else does, I don't want to ask too many questions.
No, please. I mean, as I said, it's just like sort of crazy since we usually take a semester to figure this.
And I saw that Sierra had a question in the chat around the relationship between investors and the U.S. government after the Civil War, and if that was another way to bankrupt the South. I'll let the question go.
So this question actually also this question is at the heart of the constitutional law class I teach, because the finance interests in the North were extremely conservative after the Civil War. They could have, so to put it, to leave some of the complexities aside, I think Sierra is exactly right. If you think about greenbacks, the US could have spent as much as it needed for Reconstruction, as long as it taxed it in at some level that kept things, that maintained the trust somebody mentioned early on, right? There was no limit, theoretically, to what the US could have spent. But it would require taxation, it would require commitment, it was a project, a political project. The finance interests in the North were interested first in banking, and banks were, and there was a global movement in that era to go onto the gold standard, which limited the amount that banks could lend because it limited the reserve, which was gold coin, to the smallest possible reserve, right? They could have used greenbacks as reserve. They could have used Federal Reserve notes. Today we use Federal Reserve notes. When you hear people talking about going back to the gold standard, it's nuts. Because what it would do would be shrink the reserve to a very small amount, which was just the amount of gold coin, and banks could not lend much. So the financiers who were interested in the gold standard, because it was sweeping, they thought it was, the standard of civilization. They thought you had to be on gold for all sorts of complicated reasons, but also very conservative ones. They basically broke Reconstruction, in my view. So I think that's exactly what happened, is that once the US committed to banks and committed to the gold standard, Reconstruction was over. They couldn't do it. They couldn't afford it. And if you look at, there are people who have looked at the voting in Congress, and if you look regionally and the interest groups, it's the financiers are a very important group against spending enough to basically, create a just and equitable economic development in the South. It's a really sad story, actually. Jack, did you want to do one more question? Or I know we're actually at time, but.
Sure, and I guess this kind of ties back to the public banking movement, and I guess my question is, rather than a public bank, would it make more sense to have more banks that are owned by diverse founders and within diverse communities within the current banking structure that there is, and give them the right to make money as well?
So it would certainly help. I don't know if it would cure the problem, because they would also be profit motivated, right? And so they wouldn't necessarily lend to the poorer or riskier entrepreneurs within their community. So I think maybe there's room for both, I guess I would say, with one kind of caveat, which is that for the last century or so, it's been very popular for Black and white politicians to say, the Black community should pull itself up on the basis of its own banks. And there've been and there have been some very successful stories of Black banks. The problem is that there's also structural disadvantage that has handicapped those banks from the beginning. So banks, when I was talking about how much they set off against each other, they depend on a network in order to work. And what has happened historically to Black banks in the United States is they've been shut out of the network because of discrimination. It's been a kind of cynical thing by white politicians saying, sure, let's have Black banks, let the Black community pull itself up by its own bootstraps. But those Black banks have been shut out of the network, the credit network that is dominated by white banks. And the other kind of long-running problem for those banks is, because they had poorer populations coming out of the Civil War, most of their lending was small lending and lending on residential for mortgages. The small lending is really hard because it costs a bank more to do. And the lending on mortgages was undermined by redlining and by discrimination. Right? So, these banks are lending to Black home buyers whose neighborhoods then lose value because of redlining. That is to say, their mortgages lose value, and then that puts the banks out of business. So I don't know if you have Mirza Baradar coming next month for the Racial Capitalism Month, but you might want to get her. She basically tells that story about how it's become this, in a world that is basically discriminatory and unjust, that depends on a network and depends on equal treatment. You can't have Black banks survive because they are chronically denied those essential ingredients for success. So she's very pessimistic about, she's just seen too many times the argument turn into a ploy to, basically turn people towards banks that are doomed to failure because they're disadvantaged by the structures. That's not a very happy note to end on, but let me end on this note, which is, once you start taking apart money, the difference between the myth and the basic and banked monies, are that you can see there's all this decision-making and design work that is in the way money works, right? I mean, it's like a complicated institution, the way money works. It's not just something that rises to the surface. It's a complicated institution, and that means that there's lots of opportunity for redesigning the institution, for rethinking it, for getting into the intricacies, which, like I said, takes us a semester, for thinking about how we could reform it exactly along the lines of Jock's question. What could we do that would actually make this system work more justly and spread money out more equitably? And I think there's many things we could do.
Great. Well, want to just say thank you for, or I guess, James, are you going to hop in? I guess I'll start by saying thanks, and I'll hand it over to James.
Nah, I mean, for sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Christine. Really appreciate your time here with us. And I always feel like I learned so much from these workshops with you. So I'm grateful for your time. And for folks that are that marks the end of our co-learn, our workshop. Yes, our money series. So if you are in fact, so I'm going to end the recording there. So.